On February 4th, 2010, a family of 4 seemingly vanished into thin air from their home in Fallbrook, California. Joseph McStay, 40, his wife Summer, 43, and their 2 young sons, Gianni, 4, and Joseph Jr., 3, simply disappeared. Their home showed no signs of struggle. Their cars were in the driveway. Food was left rotting on the counter. Days later, their SUV was found abandoned near the Mexican border, and grainy surveillance footage appeared to show a family of 4 crossing into Tijuana on foot. Had the McStays fled to Mexico for a fresh start? Were they victims of foul play? For nearly 4 years, the case remained one of California's most baffling missing persons mysteries. Then, in November 2013, a motorcyclist riding in the remote Mojave Desert made a horrific discovery: shallow graves containing the remains of all 4 McStays. They had been murdered. This is the story of the McStay family, a haunting mystery of disappearance, desert graves, and a shocking betrayal that would take years to unravel. Part 1. The Family. Joseph McStay was a 40-year-old entrepreneur living in Fallbrook, California, a small town in San Diego County, about an hour north of San Diego. Joseph ran a successful custom water fountain business called Earth-Inspired Products. He designed and imported decorative fountains from Mexico and sold them to customers across the United States. It was a good business that allowed him to support his family comfortably. Joseph had met Summer Martinez in the mid-2000s. Summer was a vivacious woman with a warm personality. The two fell in love and married, and Summer brought a daughter from a previous relationship into the family. Together, Joseph and Summer had 2 sons, Gianni, born in 2005, and Joseph Jr., born in 2006. By 2010, they were a happy family of 4 living in a nice home in the quiet community of Fallbrook. Those who knew the McStays described them as a close-knit, loving family. Joseph was a dedicated father who doted on his boys. Summer was a devoted mother who homeschooled the children. The family enjoyed spending time together, going to the park, taking trips, doing family activities. By all accounts, they had everything going for them: a successful business, a beautiful home, healthy children, and a bright future. But beneath the surface, there were some stresses. Joseph's business, while successful, had its challenges. There were issues with suppliers in Mexico, problems with manufacturing, and the usual stresses of running a small business. Joseph was also dealing with some health issues he had developed, what he thought might be allergies or food sensitivities that were causing him discomfort. Still, nothing seemed so serious that it would cause a family to simply disappear. Yet that's exactly what happened in February 2010. Part 2. The Disappearance. The last confirmed sighting of the McStay family was on February 4th, 2010. That evening, around 7:47 p.m., neighbors' security cameras captured the McStays' white Isuzu Trooper leaving their home on Avocado Vista Lane in Fallbrook. The vehicle was seen driving away from the house. After that moment, the McStay family was never seen or heard from again. For the first few days, their disappearance wasn't immediately noticed. Joseph ran his own business from home, so it wasn't unusual for him to not be in the office. Summer homeschooled the children, so they weren't expected at school. The family kept somewhat to themselves in their quiet neighborhood. But as days passed, people began to worry. Business associates couldn't reach Joseph. Family members' phone calls went unanswered. On February 13th, 2010, 9 days after the family was last seen, Joseph's brother, Michael McStay, went to the Fallbrook home to check on them. What he found was deeply disturbing. The house appeared as if the family had simply walked out in the middle of their normal routine and never returned. The family's dogs were in the backyard, hungry and thirsty, but alive. Inside the house, food was left out on the counters, eggs and popcorn that had been sitting there long enough to rot. The house was otherwise relatively neat, no signs of a struggle, no signs of violence, but clear signs that something had interrupted the family's normal life. Joseph's white Isuzu Trooper was not at the house. 2 car seats for the young boys were missing. Some of the family's personal items appeared to be gone, though it was hard to tell exactly what might be missing. Michael immediately called the police. The San Diego County Sheriff's Department began investigating the disappearance of the McStay family. Investigators found some puzzling clues. Joseph's laptop computer was still in the house. Analysis of the computer showed internet searches that seemed strange searches for living in Mexico, searches for passports for children, searches related to traveling to Mexico. The computer had been used on February 4th, the day the family disappeared, and showed searches about Mexican beaches and travel. Joseph's cell phone records showed his phone had been used to make calls and check voicemail until February 8th, 4 days after the family was last seen. But then all activities stopped. Summer's phone had stopped being used on February 6th. The family's bank accounts showed activity until February 5th. ATM withdrawals were made, totaling about $1,000. After February 5th, no bank activity at all. Perhaps most intriguingly, on February 8th, 4 days after the family disappeared, the McStay's white Isuzu Trooper was found parked in a shopping center parking lot in San Isidro, California, the border town immediately adjacent to Tijuana, Mexico. The vehicle was found just blocks from the border crossing. When investigators examined the vehicle, they found the car seats for the boys still inside. There was nothing else unusual about the vehicle, no signs of violence, no evidence of foul play. It appeared the family had simply parked there and walked away. Then came the surveillance footage that would define the case for years. Part 3, the border crossing. On February 8th, 2010, the same day the McStay's vehicle was found abandoned near the border surveillance cameras at the San Isidro border crossing, captured grainy footage of what appeared to be a family of 4 walking across the border into Tijuana, Mexico. The footage showed an adult male, an adult female, and 2 small children walking through the pedestrian crossing into Mexico at approximately 7 p.m. The video quality was poor, grainy, black and white, shot from a distance. The individuals' faces were not clearly visible, but the basic description seemed to match the McStay family. Adult man, adult woman, 2 small children approximately the right ages. This footage became the centerpiece of the investigation. Had the McStays voluntarily fled to Mexico? The evidence seemed to suggest they had. Internet searches about Mexico on their computer, their vehicle found near the border, surveillance footage of a family crossing into Mexico, no signs of violence or struggle at their home. The theory developed that perhaps Joseph had business problems he couldn't solve, or legal issues, or debt. Perhaps he and Summer decided to start fresh in Mexico. Perhaps they had simply walked away from their life in California. But there were problems with this theory. First, the family had left behind almost all their possessions. While some personal items seemed to be missing, the vast majority of their belongings, clothes, toys, valuables, were still in the house. Would a family planning to start a new life in Mexico really leave with almost nothing? Second, Joseph's business was actually doing fairly well. While there were challenges, there was no evidence of catastrophic financial problems that would cause someone to flee the country. Third, the family had left behind their beloved dogs with no arrangements for their care. Would loving pet owners really abandon their animals to starve? Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, no one had heard from the McStays since they disappeared. They hadn't contacted any family members, any friends, any business associates. For a family with 2 young children to completely cut off all contact with everyone they knew seemed extremely unlikely. And there were questions about that border crossing footage. Was it really the McStays? The video quality was so poor that positive identification was impossible. The adults in the video appeared to be the right height and build, but so would millions of other people. And were those really children the right ages? Some experts who analyzed the footage weren't sure. The family's loved ones didn't believe the McStays had voluntarily gone to Mexico. Joseph's brother, Michael, was adamant that his brother would never abandon his business and family without a word. Summer's family felt the same way. This wasn't something Summer would do. But without evidence of foul play, and with that suggestive border crossing footage, the official theory remained that the McStays had gone to Mexico voluntarily. The case was investigated as a missing persons case, not a criminal case. Months passed, then years. Occasional reported sightings of the family in Mexico were investigated, but never confirmed. The case grew cold. The McStay family had seemingly vanished, and no one knew what had really happened to them. Part 4, the discovery. On November 11th, 2013, nearly 4 years after the McStays disappeared,
A motorcyclist was riding through a remote area of the Mojave Desert near Victorville, California, about 100 miles northeast of the McStay's Fallbrook home. The area was desolate, high desert scrubland, accessible only by dirt roads, rarely visited by anyone. The motorcyclist was riding through this remote location when he noticed something strange, what appeared to be human remains, partially exposed in a shallow grave. He immediately contacted authorities. When San Bernardino County Sheriff's deputies arrived at the scene, they found not one but two shallow graves, partially exposed by erosion and animal activity. The graves contained the skeletal remains of 4 individuals, 2 adults and 2 children. Within days, through dental records and DNA analysis, the remains were positively identified as Joseph McStay, Summer McStay, Gianni McStay, age 4, and Joseph McStay, Jr., age 3. The McStay family had not fled to Mexico. They had been murdered and buried in the desert, probably within days of their disappearance in February 2010. Their bodies had been lying in those shallow graves for nearly 4 years, while investigators had been looking for them in Mexico. The discovery changed everything. This was now a quadruple homicide investigation, one of the most horrific family murders in California history. Part 5. The investigation. Once the bodies were found, investigators could examine them for evidence. What they discovered was chilling. All 4 family members had been murdered by blunt force trauma to the head. The killer had bludgeoned them to death, including the 2 small children. A sledgehammer was found near the graves, likely the murder weapon. The brutality was shocking. This wasn't a quick shooting or a crime of passion that got out of hand. Someone had methodically bludgeoned a family of 4, including 2 toddlers, to death with a sledgehammer. Medical examiners determined that the murders had likely occurred around the time of the disappearance in early February 2010, which matched the timeline of when the family was last seen. Now investigators had to figure out who would want to kill the entire McStay family and why. They began by looking at Joseph's business. Joseph's company, Earth Inspired Products, imported decorative fountains from Mexico. He worked with business partners and had various business relationships that could potentially have gone sour. One name kept coming up: Charles Chase Merritt. Chase Merritt was Joseph's business partner. He had worked closely with Joseph for years, helping with the manufacturing and business side of the fountain company. Merritt handled a lot of the interaction with Mexican suppliers and manufacturers. He and Joseph had worked together successfully, and by most accounts, they were friends as well as business associates. Merritt had been interviewed early in the investigation, back when the family was simply missing. He told investigators that he had last spoken with Joseph on February 4th, 2010, the day the family disappeared. Joseph had called him that evening to discuss business matters. Merritt said it was a normal conversation. Nothing seemed wrong, and that was the last time he heard from his friend. But now, with the bodies discovered and a murder investigation underway, investigators took a much closer look at Chase Merritt. What they found was troubling. Part 6. The evidence against Merritt. As investigators dug into Chase Merritt's background and activities around the time of the murders, a disturbing picture began to emerge. First, there was financial evidence. Investigators discovered that Merritt had been embezzling money from Joseph's business. He had been writing checks to himself from the business account without Joseph's knowledge. In the months before the disappearance, he had stolen thousands of dollars. Furthermore, QuickBooks records from Joseph's computer showed that Joseph had discovered the embezzlement. On February 4th, 2010, the very day the family disappeared, Joseph had been going through financial records and had discovered the fraudulent checks. He had likely been preparing to confront Merritt or even report him to authorities. Merritt had a financial motive. Joseph had discovered he was stealing and was about to expose him. Second, there was call record evidence. Cell phone records showed that Merritt had called Joseph's phone multiple times on February 4th. The last call from Merritt to Joseph was at 8:28 p.m. on February 4th, about 40 minutes after the McStay's vehicle was seen leaving their home. More tellingly, after February 4th, Merritt stopped calling Joseph's phone. For someone who was supposedly a close friend and business partner, it was strange that he would just stop trying to contact Joseph after he went missing. It suggested Merritt knew Joseph wasn't going to answer because he knew Joseph was dead. Third, there was location evidence. Cell phone tower data placed Merritt's phone in the area near where the bodies were found, the remote desert location near Victorville, around the time of the disappearance. This area was nowhere near Merritt's home, or anywhere he would normally be, but it was exactly where the bodies were buried. Fourth, there was the financial activity after the murders. After the McStays disappeared, Merritt had written himself several more checks from Joseph's business account, essentially stealing from a dead man's business. He had also attempted to take over the business entirely. Fifth, there was DNA evidence. When the graves were excavated, investigators found traces of DNA. Some of that DNA was linked to Chase Merritt. Sixth, there was cadaver dog evidence. When investigators searched Merritt's home and vehicles years later, cadaver dogs specially trained to detect the scent of human remains alerted on Merritt's truck. This suggested that human remains, the McStay bodies, had been in his truck at some point. The circumstantial case against Merritt was building. Prosecutors believed they could prove what had happened. Joseph McStay had discovered that Chase Merritt was embezzling from his business. On February 4th, 2010, Joseph had been going through financial records and found the fraudulent checks. That evening, Joseph called or arranged to meet with Merritt, perhaps to confront him, perhaps to give him a chance to explain. Merritt came to the McStay home that evening, or met Joseph somewhere nearby. At some point, Merritt made the decision to kill Joseph rather than face exposure and prosecution for embezzlement, but he couldn't leave witnesses. So he murdered the entire family, Joseph Summer, little Gianni, and little Joseph Jr. Merritt then staged the scene to make it look like the family had left voluntarily. He drove the family's Isuzu Trooper to the border, left it near the crossing, and probably arranged for someone to walk across the border in a way that would be captured on surveillance cameras to create the impression the family had fled to Mexico. Meanwhile, he had transported the bodies in his truck to the remote desert location where he buried them in shallow graves, thinking they would never be found. For nearly 4 years, his plan worked. Everyone thought the McStays were in Mexico, but then erosion and animal activity exposed the graves, and the truth came out. Part 7, The Arrest and Trial. On November 5th, 2014, nearly a year after the bodies were discovered, Chase Merritt was arrested and charged with 4 counts of murder in the deaths of Joseph McStay, Summer McStay, Gianni McStay, and Joseph McStay Jr. Merritt maintained his innocence. He claimed he had nothing to do with the murders, and that he was being framed. He suggested that Mexican drug cartels might have been responsible, though there was no evidence supporting this. He claimed the evidence against him was circumstantial and didn't prove he was the killer. The case took years to come to trial. Finally, in January 2019, 9 years after the murders, the trial of Charles Chase Merritt began. The prosecution laid out their case. Merritt had embezzled from Joseph. Joseph discovered it, and Merritt killed the entire family to cover up his theft and avoid prosecution. The evidence included financial records showing embezzlement, QuickBooks records showing Joseph discovered the theft on February 4th, cell phone records placing Merritt near the crime scene, DNA evidence linking him to the graves, cadaver dog evidence from his truck, his suspicious behavior after the disappearance. The defense argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that other people could have been responsible, and that there was reasonable doubt about Merritt's guilt. The trial lasted several months. Witnesses testified about the McStay family, Joseph's business, and the investigation. Experts testified about the evidence. The jury heard about the brutality of the murders, how even the 2 small children had been bludgeoned to death with a sledgehammer. On June 10th, 2019, after deliberating for several days, the jury returned their verdict. Guilty on all 4 counts of first-degree murder. Charles Chase Merritt had been convicted of murdering Joseph McStay, Summer McStay, Gianni McStay, age 4, and Joseph McStay Jr., age 3. Part C8, Sentencing and Aftermath. The penalty phase of the trial followed. The question now was whether Merritt should receive the death penalty or life in prison without parole. Prosecutors argued that the murders were especially heinous, killing an entire family, including 2 toddlers with a sledgehammer, and that Merritt had shown no remorse. They sought the death penalty. The defense argued for life without parole, citing Merritt's age. He was in his 60s by this time, and lack of prior violent criminal history. On January 21st, 2020, Judge Michael A. Smith sentenced Chase Merritt to death for the murders of the McStay family. Merritt was sent to San Quentin State Prison's death row to await execution. California has a lengthy appeals process for death penalty cases, so actual execution, if it happens, would be many years away. California also has an informal moratorium on executions, so Merritt may spend the rest of his life in prison without ever being executed. For the McStay family's loved ones, the conviction brought some measure of closure, though it could never bring back Joseph, Summer, Gianni, and Joseph Jr. Michael McStay, Joseph's brother, spoke about the relief of finally knowing what happened and seeing justice served. But he also spoke about the unbearable pain of losing his brother, sister-in-law, and 2 young nephews to such brutal violence. Summer's family expressed similar sentiments relief that the killer had been caught and convicted, a devastating grief over the loss of Summer and her boys. The case had taken a decade to resolve, from disappearance in 2010 to conviction in 2019 to sentencing in 2020. Throughout that decade, the McStay family's story captivated the public and the media. The case had everything: a mysterious disappearance, a family that seemed to vanish into thin air, false leads about Mexico, the shocking discovery of bodies in the desert, and ultimately the betrayal by a trusted friend and business partner. Part 9. Questions and Controversies. While Chase Merritt was convicted and sentenced, some questions and controversies remain about the case. Was Merritt guilty? Merritt and his supporters maintain his innocence to this day. They argue that the evidence was circumstantial and that other suspects weren't adequately investigated. Some alternative theories have been proposed: involvement of Mexican cartels, unknown enemies, other business associates. However, the jury heard all the evidence and unanimously found Merritt guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. The border crossing footage. Who was the family captured on surveillance video crossing into Mexico on February 8th? If it wasn't the McStays, who were likely already dead by then, who was it? Prosecutors believe Merritt may have arranged for someone, perhaps people who vaguely resembled the McStays, to cross the border on foot to create a false trail. This person or persons were never identified. How were the bodies transported? The burial site was about 100 miles from the McStay home. How did Merritt, assuming he acted alone, transport 4 bodies that distance? The prosecution theory was that he put them in his truck and drove them to the desert. The cadaver dog evidence supports this. But exactly how this was accomplished remains somewhat unclear. Why kill the children? This is perhaps the most haunting question. Even if Merritt felt he had to kill Joseph to avoid prosecution for embezzlement, why kill Summer and the 2 little boys? Prosecutors argued that Merritt couldn't leave witnesses. Summer would have known he killed Joseph, but the children? They were 3 and 4 years old. The brutality of murdering 2 toddlers with a sledgehammer is almost incomprehensible. It suggests either extreme cold-bloodedness or that Merritt panicked and killed everyone in a frenzy. We may never fully understand his mindset. Other suspects? Defense attorneys argued that other people should have been investigated more thoroughly. Joseph had business dealings with people in Mexico. He had competitors and possibly enemies. Could someone else have been responsible? The prosecution's case focused heavily on Merritt, and while the jury found the evidence convincing, some argue that tunnel vision may have prevented full investigation of alternatives.